Hey there. There are no heroes in Ethiopia. It's easy to see why both sides in this horrific civil war see themselves as the good guys. But from the outside looking in, these heroic narratives fall apart. And not just because both sides are guilty of massive crimes against humanity. On one side of the conflict that broke out in November of 2020, we have the group that used to run Ethiopia, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, and its various successor organizations based here in Tigray. On the other side, we have Nobel Peace Prize winner and likely genocidaire Abiy Ahmed, the Ethiopian Prime Minister since 2018. Adding to the sea of irony the Prime Minister swims in, 3 years ago he was appointed to lead a government and party, the EPRDF, that was initially established by the Tigrayans he is now fighting. Today I'm going to explain why both sides see themselves as the heroes of this horror, and also why neither side is really worth supporting against the other one. But before we get to that, I have to point out that these stories barely scratch the surface of what's going on in Ethiopia right now. For starters, this isn't really a map of Ethiopia. This map is my poor representation of a regional division that goes back to 1995. That Tigrayan-led division may have done a better job in some places of representing Ethiopia's many ethnic divisions, but it doesn't even begin to reflect the complexity. New regions seem to be seceding at an accelerating pace now, with Sidama created in 2020 and the Southwest region created in 2021. There would have to be many more secessions to fully reflect the wishes of Ethiopia's many ethnic groups. My understanding is that no region has a homogeneous population. These names merely reflect the wishes of the largest group present. Ethiopia's growing wealth has the upside of allowing a greater degree of movement for Ethiopia's many peoples. Of course, this also leads to greater conflict, and this complexity does not end at the border. One of the hottest conflicts of the Cold War was fought over the Somali region between Ethiopia and Somalia between 1977 and 1978. Somalia isn't in the best shape right now, but a broader civil war might tempt a variety of actors to try to take the Somali region of Ethiopia for Somalia again. The recently constructed Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is another cause for concern. It utilizes a source of the Nile River, which makes Egypt and now Sudan very, very uncomfortable. In the past, I've mocked the idea that Egypt would do a bombing run on the dam, but the longer the Ethiopian civil war goes on, the less ridiculous that scenario sounds. Eritrea only won its independence from Ethiopia in 1991. Despite fighting a long war that helped to put the TPLF in power, the Eritrean government hates Tigray and is already deeply involved in the current conflict. There is way too much complexity here to do justice to in a single YouTube video. I just wanted to point out that there are multiple smaller conflicts going on here, and if the war drags on for another year, many more small conflicts and large conflicts are likely to break out within Ethiopia and across the region. Today, I want to focus on what I see as the most powerful groups: the Tigrayans, the Amhara, and the Oromo. The Oromo are Ethiopia's largest group, and they have a glorious history. In the early modern period, they first fought Ethiopia and then ruled over large parts of it through various dynasties. My understanding, however, is that they lost out in the consolidation of the Ethiopian Empire in the 1800s. From the 1840s to the 1970s, a struggle for power between the Tigrayan and Amhara aristocrats became much more important. Again, this is a dramatic oversimplification. Already in the 19th century, there was some mixing of peoples, and well into the 20th century, traditional ideas of aristocratic competition could be more important than ethnicity and nationalism. But I do think it's fair to say that as the Ethiopian Empire consolidated and fought off the Europeans, the Amhara and Tigrayan people reaped more of the benefits than Ethiopia's other groups. Let's take a look at one last map detail that's vital to the current conflict. The borders of today's Tigray region were settled in the 1990s, and the Amhara firmly believe that Western Tigray was stolen from them in this division. In the early days of the current war, in late 2020, Amhara militias, backed up by the Ethiopian and Eritrean militaries, seized this region, cutting Tigray off from any access to the outside world and committing horrific crimes in the process. Despite taking back all of eastern Tigray and invading and occupying other Amhara territory, the Tigrayans have yet to dislodge their enemies from western Tigray. This is one of the most important issues in today's war. To truly understand what's happening here, we need to roll the clock back to the birth of the TPLF. In 1974, Ethiopia's ancient emperor, Haile Selassie, was overthrown by a group known as the Derg, which quickly became a communist dictatorship under Mengistu. They deposed and murdered the old emperor, and with Soviet support, imposed one of the bloodier dictatorships of the century. In the process, the communist dictatorship actually accelerated the old emperor's project of creating a more unified Ethiopian identity. I guess you could maybe see this as a step forward in some ways, but it also created massive problems. The Derg inspired ethnic-based resistance all over the country, which they crushed brutally. They successfully stamped out most of it, but they could not defeat the forces of that not yet independent Eritrea and the mountainous Tigray region. One of my first memories of international politics is the 1980s famine in Ethiopia. This is widely regarded to have been started, or at least exacerbated, by the Ethiopian government under Mengistu, in furtherance of its war against Eritrea and Tigray. Hundreds of thousands were starved to death in an attempt to save this doomed communist regime. This memory of famine in the same northern regions that are being fought over today is one good reason why the international diplomatic community tends to be more sympathetic to the Tigrayans. Despite the famine, the Eritreans and the TPLF hung on, and when the Soviet Union decided to stop supporting Mengistu, they won. The Eritreans got their independence in 1991, and the TPLF got to form the government and the ruling party that controlled Ethiopia from 1991 all the way up until 2019. Even back then, despite their military victory, the Tigrayans recognized that they couldn't openly run a country of almost 100 million with just 5 to 7% of the population. So they carefully formed the EPRDF, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, a coalition of different Ethiopian ethnic parties that could run the country. For most of the past 30 years, Ethiopia has been run along the principles of ethnic federalism. That's what the new map was about, and that's what the new constitution was about. The TPLF and its allies are still fighting for the principles of that constitution today. But as the Western Tigray controversy indicates, it's important to remember that the Tigrayans were the first among equals in this ethnic federation, both in the EPRDF party and in the government of Ethiopia as a whole. Meles Zenawi, Ethiopia's strikingly successful, though somewhat authoritarian leader from 1991 until his death from natural causes in 2012, was a Tigrayan. All Ethiopians got richer during the EPRDF government, but Tigrayans, just 6 or 7 million out of a population of 110 million, took a larger slice of the benefits. Most of the key posts in the Ethiopian government and military went to Tigrayans. Even the international face of Ethiopia is disproportionately Tigrayan. The current head of the World Health Organization isn't just a Tigrayan, he was a highly placed member of the TPLF. All of this means that the Tigrayans have much closer ties to the outside world than any other Ethiopians do. I don't want to fall down a conspiracy rabbit hole and start talking like the TikTok commenters who believe the TPLF is a US plot, but it is an undeniable fact that the Tigrayan view of this conflict is much better represented in international news coverage than the views of the other 105 million Ethiopians. It's not a conspiracy, it's just true to say that the majority of international diplomats, scholars, and journalists are more favorable towards Tigrayan interests, simply because those are the Ethiopians they are more likely to have met and to have personal and professional relationships with. The significance of a Zoom call between foreigners and Tigrayans has been ridiculously overstated, but that doesn't mean that foreign diplomats haven't been biased. Last month, most Western media seemed confident that Addis Ababa, the capital, and the Ethiopian government were both about to fall to the Tigrayans. In the ensuing month, the exact opposite has happened. The Ethiopian government has won a string of victories, and the Tigrayans have been pushed back into their own province. In retrospect, this should have been obvious. No matter how successful they had been, the Tigrayans are still just 5 to 7% of the country, and they were never closer than 160 miles from the capital. The idea of them conquering the Ethiopian government should have been transparently ridiculous, but the trusted sources of most Western scholars and journalists tend to be Tigrayan, so we all got it wrong. I'm certainly conscious of this bias in my own coverage. I don't think I really have to retract anything yet. In fact, I think I was a little too friendly to Abiy Ahmed earlier in the war, but in the last video I may have been a little too hard on Ethiopia's genocidal prime minister. I'm trying to do better this time around. In one respect, the international affection for the Tigrayan leadership is justified. In the 1990s and the 2000s, Ethiopia went from being a synonym for starvation to an economic development miracle. In fact, I believe that the way that the EPRDF government eventually fell apart is actually an indication of the TPLF's success. With the end of famine and with war only on the northern border with Eritrea, the whole country was able to develop. And with this development came the question why Tigray was taking so many of the benefits. This was especially important to the Oromo, Ethiopia's largest ethnic group. Meles Zenawi's successors were unable to match his revolutionary credibility or his governing prowess. Throughout the 2010s, instability increased, ethnic tensions rose, and the EPRDF found itself using violent repression against the Oromo majority more and more often. It was clear that the EPRDF was losing control of the country. And then they found an answer. That answer was Abiy Ahmed. Abiy Ahmed is an Oromo, and the EPRDF at the time thought that by putting him in charge as a figurehead, they could quiet the protest movement and hold on to power. It worked phenomenally well until Abiy Ahmed got so popular that he was able to dissolve the EPRDF in 2019. By 2020, he had so concretely marginalized the old Tigrayan leadership that they felt like they had to launch a war against him to hold on to any power at all. Abiy Ahmed claims to represent the 100 million other Ethiopians against their former Tigray masters. This is propaganda, but that doesn't mean it's completely untrue. The ideas of national unity and justice for all that Abiy pushes are powerful and appealing, especially among Ethiopia's growing urban classes. But Abiy's attempts to end ethnic divisions politically are also extremely dangerous and destabilizing in the Ethiopian context. For most of the past 3 decades, Ethiopia has functioned as a one-party state. There were other parties, but it strikes me that they were mostly window dressing. It's not clear to me that the 1994 Ethiopian constitution can function without the EPRDF. The ethnically federal constitution might need the ethnically federal party to work at all. And Abiy Ahmed's new prosperity party, the pan-ethnic one, well, that might need the war against the old bosses to continue to keep winning elections. One indication of the complexity facing the country is the question of Oromo loyalties. The Ethiopian Prime Minister is Oromo, but there are apparently Oromo parties that disapprove of the move away from ethnic federalism. They wanted Oromo people and parties to profit from the Oromo Prime Minister, not to have that Prime Minister dissolve the ethnic system. I think outside media has blown this out of proportion a bit, taking the fact that some Oromo parties have turned against Abiy Ahmed as an indication that he's lost the support of all 35 million Oromo. It's clear that he's lost some support. How much? I don't know, and it's not clear to me that anybody else knows either. The politics of Oromia seem to be just as complicated as everything else in Ethiopia. The war definitely helped Abiy Ahmed's Prosperity Party win an election this past September. Tigray's friends in the Western media prefer not to talk about this election too much, but I think it's telling that they can't fully condemn it. Yes, some opposition parties boycotted it, but it's clear that this election was not stolen. It's an uncomfortable truth that Abiy Ahmed has the support of the majority of Ethiopians that he is not currently starving to death. That is something that has to be acknowledged. But the forces that have been unleashed are becoming more and more terrifying. Now that the Tigrayans have been pushed back into their home province, it may be time to worry more seriously about genocide again. And even if we do get peace, it's not clear to me that the Prosperity Party will be able to hold Ethiopia together. I'm not going to apologize for calling the Ethiopian Prime Minister genocidal. The blocking of humanitarian aid to Tigray alone fits the bill. But I do think I owe Abiy Ahmed an apology for the definiteness with which I claimed that he alone had started the war last year. I ran a video in November 2020 implying that we knew exactly what had happened and why this war had started, and it's become clear that that is not the case. It's entirely possible that the Tigrayans could have started the shooting war. When Abiy Ahmed dissolved the EPRDF in 2019, the TPLF refused to join his new Prosperity Party. They chose to withdraw to Tigray and focus on running their own affairs, which is very much something that is allowed under the Ethiopian constitution. The problem, though, was the Ethiopian military. Not only were many of the key positions in the Ethiopian military held by Tigrayans, the main security challenge to Ethiopia over the past 30 years had been Eritrea, directly to the north of Tigray. So the biggest and most powerful elements of the Ethiopian military were mostly commanded by Tigrayans and based in Tigray. And the TPLF really wanted to keep it that way. This became a lot harder to justify in 2018 after Abiy Ahmed signed a peace agreement with Eritrea. That agreement got the Ethiopian Prime Minister the Nobel Peace Prize, but it made the Tigrayans pretty nervous. Eritrea has been described as the North Korea of Africa, and its terrifying leader, Isaias Afwerki, made peace with Ethiopia, not the Tigrayans that had been running Ethiopia up until Abiy Ahmed. The rest of the world saw peace, but the TPLF saw encirclement. So to make everybody unhappy, I think it's important to emphasize that everybody was right. Abiy Ahmed and the Tigrayans were both in an impossible situation. Abiy Ahmed is the leader of Ethiopia. He should have control of his military and be able to move it around if he wants. The TPLF had done a decent job of ruling Ethiopia and withdrawn from power, mostly voluntarily, in part to avoid engaging in further massacres. Under the Constitution, they had the right to hold on to their region's own autonomy and power. Of course, the Tigrayans had no right to hold on to Ethiopia's military, but events have shown that they were right to be afraid of the Ethiopian and Eritrean militaries, both of which are committing crimes against humanity in Tigray as we speak. The timeline leading up to the start of war in November 2020 will probably be argued over for decades, but it now seems likely that the TPLF may have started the war, attacking the Ethiopian military and taking a large cache of weapons. It now seems probable that I was wrong to blame Abiy Ahmed for starting the shooting. This does not mean that Abiy Ahmed is blameless. The Ethiopian government was probably attacked by an armed group of Tigrayans. That does not mean that genocidal actions against Western Tigrayan farmers are justified. This idea is exactly as ridiculous as the old Turkish argument that the Armenian genocide was just fine because there were a few Armenians who fought for Russia. Crimes against civilians do not become okay just because there is a war on. Quick note from the editing suite. It strikes me that I would be a terrible hypocrite if I didn't point out the way that my own country violates this same admonition. This is especially true after the past month of blockbuster reporting from the New York Times that has pointed out how the drone warfare of the United States has failed to meet any standards of decency or just basic lack of criminality. We have participated in a mass mass slaughter of civilians. And in some ways, this is even more unforgivable than what the Ethiopians are engaged in today and what the Turks were engaged in a century ago. Because unlike those countries, the United States has never been under any kind of real threat over the past 20 years. Moving on. So far, despite the pro-Tigray bias of most Western media, the U.S. has done a surprisingly good job of staying out of the conflict. Ethiopian government supporters, of course, believe that the United States is working against them, but I've seen very little evidence of that. For one thing, the conflict's been going on for a year, and there are no significant sanctions against the Ethiopian government or the Ethiopian Prime Minister. In September, Joe Biden finally issued an executive order providing the authority for sanctions. Crucially, the order does not pick sides. It gives the State Department the right to sanction Ethiopia and the TPLF, but no sanctions have been ordered against either of the Ethiopian actors to date. In November, we saw the U.S. State Department issue the first real sanctions, but they are only against Eritrean entities. Yes, Eritrea is allied with the Ethiopian government against Tigray, but it's still a foreign government invading a neighbor to do war crimes. It's very hard for me to be angry about these sanctions. U.S. indecision on this conflict has been infuriating to both sides. Recently, a highly placed Tigrayan politician publicly blasted the United States for not supporting the Tigrayans. Of course, Ethiopian government propagandists took selections of this speech out of context and used it to prove that the United States was supporting the Tigrayans. Everybody's getting driven a little nuts by this. Both sides are confused and hurt that the United States isn't piling in to help them, which I think is probably a sign that we've adopted the right policy. Both sides have strong arguments, and we shouldn't be rushing in to support one side or the other just to do something. One of the worst things about U.S. foreign policy is the way that we tend to pick a good guy and a bad guy and just keep supporting one side forever, no matter what happens on the ground. Our Ethiopia policy over the past year has shifted in response to developments. That's a much smarter way of dealing with the world. At the outset of the conflict in November 2020, when the Ethiopian government achieved what looked like a lightning-quick victory, we were concerned about the fate of the Tigrayan minority and reports of crimes against humanity against them. It's now clear that well-connected Tigrayans were better able to get their message out than other persecuted minorities often are, but so what? Atrocities were happening. Whether you support or condemn the Ethiopian government, it shouldn't matter. A minority was being crushed. Concern was appropriate. This concern turned to happy shock and probably a little too much excitement in June of 2021, when the Tigrayan forces came roaring back, capturing most of their own province as well as thousands of prisoners of war. This was objectively good news. A minority in danger of being genocided didn't just survive, it crushed the militaries that were sent against it. It remains a cool story, but it fooled us into giving the Tigrayans a blank check they didn't deserve. Instead of using this moment of Ethiopian government vulnerability to force a ceasefire on both parties, we kept cheering on our plucky revolutionaries as they went on to commit the same sorts of genocidal acts against civilians in the Amhara and Afar regions that had been committed against them. There is a vast power differential between tiny Tigray and the Ethiopian government. We've seen this in effect over the past month as that government has gone from victory to victory. This will always make outsiders more naturally charitable towards Tigray. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't supremely messed up, that much of the world media seemed to be celebrating the Tigrayan march on Addis Ababa over the past 6 months. I think the other 100 million Ethiopians are going to be angry about that for quite some time, and they are right to be. At the beginning of November, after the fall of the towns Dessie and Kombolcha to the Tigrayans, Washington, D.C. shifted its sympathies a bit, realizing that the fall of the legitimate government might really be possible, and just how destabilizing that could be. The U.S. finally got serious about working with the African Union towards a ceasefire. And this is speculative, but it's pretty clear to me that someone in the United States told the United Arab Emirates that they could take the gloves back off and go back to supporting the Ethiopian government wholeheartedly. Of course, we now know that the Tigrayan advance also galvanized the Ethiopian government, prompting it to finally draw its massive resources together and push the Tigrayans back. And now they have accomplished that goal. As of last week, the Tigrayans have been forced back into their own province. We have a real chance for a Christmas peace, a holiday that Ethiopians celebrate on January 7th. By the time I finish producing this video, the chance for this peace may have already dissipated. But it's important that the world community do what it can to get a ceasefire. In Ethiopia's war, both sides seem convinced that the United States is against them, and I kind of like that. We shouldn't be picking sides here. We do need to be vigilant against any truly genocidal actions against the Tigrayans, but we also shouldn't be helping the Tigrayans take back control of a country of 110 million that doesn't want them in charge anymore. Honestly, I think the US response so far should be kind of a model for us going forward in other regions. Wishy-washy is the way to go. We should respond to events as they happen, not pick a side and fight for it. There are no heroes in Ethiopia. Nobody deserves our intervention on their side. Maybe some sanctions to try to encourage a ceasefire might be appropriate, but we should let the Ethiopians figure this out on their own. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks.